The sulfur head of the match trembled against the rough wooden striker, held in fingers that had known nothing but calluses and cruelty for 16 years. Josiah crouched in the suffocating darkness of Hibernia Plantation's cellar, surrounded by the sharp stench of kerosene and the musty decay of Florida's August humidity. Above his head, the floorboards groaned and shuddered under the weight of dancing wedding guests, their laughter cascading down through the mansion's bones like poison through veins. He struck the match. The flame bloomed orange and hungry in the blackness, casting wild shadows across the oil-soaked rags he had carefully arranged around the cellar's support beams. The light flickered across his dark skin, revealing eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young, eyes that had witnessed horrors no child should ever see. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the memory of other hands larger and crueler, that had taken everything from him just 3 weeks ago. Mama's hands, reaching for him as Master Whitmore's boot connected with her ribs. The match dropped. Fire caught the first kerosene-soaked cloth with a soft whoosh, the flame spreading like liquid lightning across the fabric. The heat hit Josiah's face immediately. Florida's oppressive summer air turned the cellar into an oven even without the addition of fire. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he watched the flames dance higher, licking at the cypress wood that held up this monument to human suffering. Above, a fiddle struck up a lively tune, accompanied by the stomping of boots and the rustle of silk gowns. The wedding celebration of Miss Cordelia Whitmore to Thaddeus Ashford was in full swing. The cream of Florida society gathered under one roof. They danced on the graves of his people, celebrated love while denying the humanity of those who served them. Their joy would be short-lived. Josiah moved with practiced stealth to the second pile of rags, his bare feet silent against the packed earth floor. The cellar stretched beneath the entire mansion, its low ceiling supported by thick wooden posts that had been seasoned by decades of humid southern air. Perfect kindling for what was to come. He had spent weeks studying this space, measuring distances, calculating how quickly the fire would spread through the mansion's dry timber frame. Another match flared to life. "Josiah, baby, you stay hidden now," his mother Seraphina had whispered that terrible night, her voice already thick with blood. "Don't you come out no matter what you hear." But he had heard. God help him, he had heard everything. The second fire caught with the same eager hunger as the first. Orange light began to fill the cellar, revealing shelves lined with preserves and wine bottles, barrels of flour and salt pork, all the provisions needed to sustain the Whitmore family's lavish lifestyle. Built on the backs of people like his mother, people whose names would never be spoken with reverence, whose deaths would never be mourned by those who profited from their suffering. A particularly loud burst of laughter echoed from above, followed by applause and the clink of champagne glasses. Josiah could picture them clearly, Master Cornelius Whitmore in his finest black tailcoat, his wife Evangeline draped in pearls and silk, their daughter Cordelia radiant in white lace that had probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The Ashford family, equally resplendent, celebrated the union that would combine two of Florida's most prosperous plantation dynasties. They had no idea that death crouched in their cellar, lighting matches with steady hands. The third pile of rags erupted into flame as Josiah's match touched the kerosene-soaked cotton. The heat was becoming oppressive now, the air thick and shimmering. Smoke began to curl upward, seeking cracks between the floorboards. Soon, very soon, someone would smell it. But by then it would be too late. Master Whitmore's face twisted with rage and something darker, looming over his mother's broken form. "You dare raise a hand to me, you worthless!" The crack of his riding crop across her skull. The way she crumpled like a rag doll, crimson spreading across her torn dress. "Mama!" The word had torn from Josiah's throat before he could stop it, revealing his hiding place behind the chicken coop. Master Whitmore's cold smile. "Well now, looks like we got ourselves a witness." Josiah's hand tightened around his remaining matches as the memory crashed over him with the force of a hurricane. He could still smell the blood, still see the way the Spanish moss had looked draped with red in the moonlight where they'd thrown her body, still hear Master Whitmore's voice as he'd grabbed Josiah by the throat. "You keep your mouth shut about this, boy, or you'll join her. Accidents happen all the time on plantations. Dogs go missing. Boys fall in wells. You understand me? But accidents could happen to masters too, especially when they were trapped in burning mansions with no way out." The fourth fire caught with a roar that echoed through the cellar like the voice of an angry god. Flames raced along the kerosene-soaked trail Josiah had laid, connecting each pile of combustible material in a growing web of destruction. The support posts began to smoke, their aged wood drinking in the heat like desert sand drinks rain. Above, the music continued, but there was a subtle change now. A few voices raised in confusion, perhaps catching the first faint whiff of smoke. Josiah smiled grimly as he lit his fifth and final pile of rags. Let them smell it. Let them panic. It was already too late. The cellar had become an inferno, orange light dancing across the stone walls like demons celebrating a victory. The heat was unbearable now, forcing Josiah back toward the narrow stairs that led to the kitchen. But he didn't retreat yet. He needed to see this through, needed to watch justice take root in flame and smoke. A woman's voice drifted down from above, sharp with alarm. Is that smoke? Evangeline, do you smell smoke? The fiddle music faltered, then stopped entirely. Josiah closed his eyes and let the sound of growing panic wash over him. This was for his mother, for every lash of the whip she'd endured, for every cruel word and degrading command, for the way Master Whitmore had looked at her sometimes, with a hunger that had made Josiah's skin crawl, for the night 3 weeks ago when that hunger had finally consumed her. You thought you could protect him, didn't you? Master Whitmore had laughed as Seraphina lay dying. Thought you could keep him pure and innocent? Boy's 16 now, Seraphina, almost a man. Maybe it's time he learned what men do. That was when she'd found the strength to grab Master Whitmore's ankle, to dig her fingernails into his flesh and draw blood. Her final act of defiance. Her last breath had rattled in her throat as the riding crop came down again. Footsteps thundered across the floor above, running now, shouting. Someone was bellowing orders, probably Master Whitmore trying to maintain control as his perfect evening crumbled into chaos. The irony wasn't lost on Josiah. The man who controlled every aspect of his slaves' lives was about to learn what it felt like to have control ripped away. Smoke poured upward through the floorboards now, thick and choking. The cellar had become a vision of hell, flames consuming everything they touched. The wine bottles were beginning to crack from the heat, their contents hissing as they met the fire. The wooden shelves groaned and splintered, adding fresh fuel to the growing conflagration. Josiah finally retreated up the narrow cellar stairs, but only far enough to avoid the worst of the heat. He pressed himself against the kitchen door, listening to the chaos erupting in the mansion above. Screams were beginning to mix with the shouts now, high panicked sounds that spoke of true terror. The wedding guests had realized this was no small kitchen fire that could be quickly extinguished. Through the keyhole, he could see into the kitchen where enslaved women who had been preparing the wedding feast now stood frozen in shock. They understood the implications better than their masters. They knew how quickly fire could consume a wooden structure, how easily escape routes could become death traps. Run, Josiah whispered, though he knew they couldn't hear him. Get out while you still can. Some of them would escape. The smart ones who didn't waste time trying to save their oppressors, but others would die trying to help the very people who had enslaved them, their humanity proving stronger than their desire for freedom. It was the cruelest irony of all. The fire roared behind him now, a living thing with its own hunger and will. Smoke billowed up through every crack and crevice, filling the mansion's lower level with choking darkness. Soon it would reach the main floor, then spread to the upper levels where many of the wedding guests would be trapped. Josiah thought of his mother's body floating in the cypress swamp, her blood mixing with the dark water while Spanish moss swayed overhead like mourning veils. He thought of Master Whitmore's cold laughter, of the promises of further violence that had glittered in the man's eyes. Justice was coming for Hibernia Plantation, carrying on wings of flame and smoke. If you're enjoying this dark tale, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. The kitchen door swung open with a crash that echoed through the smoke-filled corridor. Josiah slipped through like a ghost, his bare feet finding familiar paths even in the growing darkness. The enslaved women who had been preparing the wedding feast scattered like startled birds, some toward the back exits, others foolishly toward the main house to warn their masters. Their voices created a chorus of terror that mixed with the hungry roar of flames below. "Fire in the cellar!" screamed Prudence the head cook, her white apron already stained with ash. "Lord have mercy, the whole place is gonna burn." But Josiah wasn't interested in mercy. Not tonight. He pressed himself against the servants' corridor wall, watching through the service entrance as the wedding guests finally began to comprehend their situation. The grand ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, had transformed into a theater of panic. Master Cornelius Whitmore stood at the center of the chaos, his black tailcoat pristine despite the ash beginning to drift down from above, bellowing orders that no one seemed capable of following. "Form bucket brigades," he shouted, his voice cutting through the screams. "Silas, get the men organized. This is just a kitchen fire. We can contain it." Just a kitchen fire. The same dismissive tone he'd used 3 weeks ago when he'd explained away Seraphina's death to the other plantation owners. Just an accident. A clumsy girl fell in the swamp. These things happen. Josiah's hand moved to the oil-soaked rag tucked in his worn trousers, along with 3 more matches wrapped in oilcloth. The cellar fire was only the beginning. Through the smoky haze, he could see Cordelia Whitmore, now Ashford, in her wedding dress, the white silk now streaked with gray ash like tear stains. Her new husband, Thaddeus, held her protectively, but his eyes darted toward the exits with the calculation of a man weighing his chances. The other guests, the Beauregards, the Suttons, the Carlyles, milled about in expensive confusion, their fine clothes and practiced manners useless against the democracy of fire. "Your mama was getting too uppity," Master Whitmore had said that night, his boot still pressed against Seraphina's broken ribs. "Thought she could protect you from your duties. But every boy grows up sometimes, don't they?" The memory burned hotter than the flames below. Josiah had been hiding behind the chicken coop when Master Whitmore had cornered his mother near the quarters, had seen the way the man's hands wandered where they shouldn't, had heard his mother's firm refusal. He'd watched her dignity in the face of violation, her courage in protecting what little innocence her son had left, and he'd seen Master Whitmore's rage when she dared to strike his wandering hands away. The riding crop had fallen like thunder, again and again, until Seraphina lay still in the dirt with blood pooling beneath her head. Then Master Whitmore had dragged her body to the cypress swamp, where the water ran black and deep, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient trees. "Accidents happen in swamps," he'd muttered, pushing her under the dark water. "Gators, snakes, quicksand, dangerous places for clumsy slaves." But Josiah had found her body the next morning, floating among the cypress knees with Spanish moss tangled in her hair like a crown. The moss that should have been gray-green was stained dark crimson, and her eyes, those gentle eyes that had sung him lullabies and told him stories of freedom, stared sightless at the canopy above. Smoke was thickening in the servants' corridor now, rolling along the ceiling like storm clouds. Josiah moved deeper into the mansion's maze of back passages, pathways known only to those who cleaned and served and remained invisible. He knew every board that creaked, every door that stuck, every window that could serve as an escape route. Knowledge was power, and tonight power belonged to him. The main staircase came into view through the smoke, a grand spiral of mahogany and gold that rose to the upper floors like a monument to excess. Already Josiah could see the orange glow of flames beginning to lick at its base. The fire from the cellar was spreading exactly as he'd planned, following the trails of kerosene he'd laid weeks ago during his nighttime reconnaissance. Above, on the second floor, he could hear more panic as smoke began seeping through the floorboards, women's voices high and terrified, mixed with the deeper tones of men trying to maintain authority in the face of chaos. Someone was hammering on a door that wouldn't open, probably the library, where Josiah had quietly turned the key in the lock hours ago. "You keep your mouth shut about what you saw," Master Whitmore had warned him after Seraphina's death, his fingers wrapped around Josiah's throat. "Your mama's gone because she forgot her place. Don't make the same mistake." But Josiah hadn't forgotten his place. He'd simply decided to change it. The service stairs beckoned, narrow, steep steps that led to the second floor where the family quarters were located. Josiah pulled out his second oil-soaked rag and one of his carefully hoarded matches. The upper level needed its own introduction to justice. As he climbed, the sounds of panic grew clearer. Through a crack in the wall, he could see into Master Whitmore's study, the same room where bills of sale for human beings were signed with flourish, where ledgers recorded the monetary value of suffering. The master of the house stood at his desk, frantically gathering papers while his wife Evangeline sobbed in the corner. "The documents," Master Whitmore was saying,
Save the property deeds, the slave manifest, even now.
Even as his world burned around him, the man thought first of his investments in human flesh. Josiah struck his match. The flame caught the oil-soaked rag with a sound like a whispered prayer. He pressed it against the wooden wall of the servants' stairway, watching as the fire took hold with eager hunger. The dry cypress wood, seasoned by decades of Florida heat and humidity, accepted the flame like an old friend. Within moments, the narrow stairway was ablaze. The fire raced upward along the walls, seeking more fuel, more space to grow. Smoke poured through cracks in the servants' quarters, adding to the choking cloud that was rapidly filling the mansion's upper levels. Through the walls, he could hear running footsteps, screams of genuine terror now as the wedding guests realized they were trapped. The main staircase was compromised by fire from below, and now their only alternate route was also impassable. The windows remained, but it was a 20-foot drop to hard ground. Survivable, perhaps, but not without cost. She was still breathing when I put her in the water. Master Whitmore had confessed to his overseer the next day, not knowing Josiah was hidden in the rafters of the tobacco barn. Had to hold her under for nearly 5 minutes before she stopped fighting. Stronger than she looked, that one. What about the boy? The overseer had asked. He'll learn. They all do eventually. Break them young, break them proper, and they stay broken. It's the ones you show mercy to that cause trouble later. But some things, once broken, became more dangerous than they'd ever been whole. Josiah descended back toward the main level, leaving his second fire to consume the servants' stairs. The mansion was beginning to groan now, the sound of stressed timber and failing supports creating a symphony of destruction. The cellar fire had done its work well. The foundation was compromised, the support beams weakened by flame and heat. In the grand ballroom, the crystal chandelier swayed ominously as the floor beneath it sagged. Some of the guests had finally overcome their shock enough to attempt organized escape, but their options were rapidly diminishing. The main entrance was blocked by debris from a collapsed beam. The French doors leading to the garden were locked, keys that Josiah had quietly removed weeks ago. Master Whitmore's voice rose above the chaos, still trying to command even as his empire crumbled. Break down the doors. Use chairs, anything. We need to get out. But the thick cypress doors, reinforced to keep intruders out, proved equally effective at keeping victims in. Through the smoke, Josiah caught sight of some of the enslaved people who had chosen to help their masters rather than flee. They struggled alongside the wedding guests, throwing water on flames that laughed at such feeble resistance. Their humanity, even in the face of years of cruelty, shone through the darkness like stars. It broke Josiah's heart even as it strengthened his resolve. Some would escape, the smart ones, the ones who understood that survival was more important than loyalty to those who had never shown them the same. But others would die trying to save the very people who had treated them as property, and their nobility would be remembered by no one but the flames that consumed them. The fire had reached the main floor now, racing along the walls and consuming the expensive furnishings with democratic hunger. Silk draperies became torches, Persian rugs turned to ash, and oil paintings of stern Whitmore ancestors melted in their gold frames. The mansion's opulence was being reduced to smoke and cinder, all the accumulated wealth of generations burning away in a single night. Josiah pulled out his third oil-soaked rag. One more fire to set, one more trail of destruction to lay. The music room, where Cordelia had practiced piano while enslaved children worked in the fields. Where the family gathered for evening entertainment while their human property was locked in windowless quarters. Where laughter and joy were purchased with suffering and blood. Justice demanded that it burn brightest of all. Above the crackling flames and terrified screams, another sound began to emerge, a sound that made Josiah's blood run cold even as satisfaction warmed his heart. From somewhere in the Spanish moss outside, carrying on the hot wind that fed the fire, came the sound of his mother's voice. "Josiah, baby. Josiah, my sweet boy. Mama's here." Whether it was memory or madness or something else entirely, Josiah couldn't say. But as he struck his third match and watched the music room catch fire, he smiled through the smoke and whispered back, "I know, Mama. I know you're here." The mansion of Hibernia Plantation burned on, and with it burned the last remnants of Josiah's childhood. What would emerge from the ashes remained to be seen. The music room erupted in flames with a sound like applause, as if the ghosts of 1,000 forced performances were finally showing their appreciation. Josiah watched through a crack in the servant's door as Master Whitmore's prized piano, the same instrument where Cordelia had practiced her scales, while children picked cotton under the merciless sun, became a funeral pyre of ivory and mahogany. The wedding cake, a three-tiered monument to excess that had required 2 days of preparation by enslaved hands, melted into a puddle of sugar and shame on its silver pedestal. The wedding guest had abandoned all pretense of dignity now. Women in silk gowns crawled along the floor, seeking breathable air beneath the thickening smoke. Men who had built fortunes on human bondage wept like children as they realized their wealth couldn't purchase escape from the democracy of fire. The crystal chandelier, that glittering symbol of southern refinement, swayed drunkenly as the ceiling beams above it buckled and groaned. From his hidden vantage point, Josiah could see everything with perfect clarity. The Beauregard patriarch, Mortimer, was trying to break down the French doors with a chair that splintered uselessly against the reinforced cypress. His wife Adelaide pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth, as if her delicate sensibilities could filter out the smoke of burning justice. Their son Richmond, barely older than Josiah himself, sobbed in a corner while his expensive clothes grew gray with ash. How many times had Richmond played with toy soldiers while real children labored in the fields? How many tea parties had Adelaide hosted while serving girls collapsed from exhaustion in the kitchen? Through the growing inferno, Josiah's eyes found his primary target. Master Cornelius Whitmore stood in the center of the ballroom's chaos, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Even now, even as his world literally burned around him, the man's first instinct was to command, to control, to assert his dominance over a situation that laughed at his authority. "Silas," he bellowed at his overseer, who crouched near the burning staircase. "Get axes. Break down these walls if you have to. I will not be defeated by a kitchen fire." But Josiah knew better. Master Whitmore's eyes weren't focusing on escape routes or rescue efforts. They were scanning the crowd, counting faces, looking for someone specific, looking for the one person who wasn't where he was supposed to be. "That boy knows something," Whitmore had muttered to his wife 3 days after Seraphina's death. "The way he looks at me now, like he's got secrets burning behind those eyes. I might need to do something about that soon." Evangeline had tisked dismissively while arranging flowers in their pristine parlor. "He's just grieving, dear. You know how attached these people get to each other. Give him time to accept his loss." "Some losses are easier to accept than others," Whitmore had replied, his meaning clear. Well, tonight, Master Whitmore would learn about acceptance, about loss that couldn't be dismissed with a wave of the hand or explained away with convenient lies. Josiah slipped deeper into the servants' passages, following routes that would take him behind the main wall of the ballroom. Through carefully planned peepholes, gaps in the old mortar that he'd widened over weeks of preparation, he could observe without being seen. The wedding guests were trapped animals now, their panic beautiful in its raw honesty. Cordelia Ashford née Whitmore had collapsed near the gift table, her white wedding dress now a canvas of gray ash and dark stains. The veil that had taken months to import from Charleston was singed and torn, hanging from her head like Spanish moss. Her new husband knelt beside her, trying to shield her from falling embers with his own body, a gesture of protection that would have been touching if he hadn't made his fortune selling human beings like cattle. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Master Whitmore had said to Thaddeus during their engagement negotiations, standing on the mansion's veranda, while Josiah served them brandy. 16 years old, pure as driven snow, never been touched by the crude realities of plantation life. "Unlike some," Thaddeus had replied with a knowing smirk, his eyes following a young enslaved woman as she carried laundry across the yard. Both men had laughed at the shared understanding, the casual assumption that some women were for wedding and some for using. Josiah struck his fourth match. This rag had been soaked not just in kerosene, but in memories, every humiliation, every casual cruelty, every moment when his humanity had been denied or dismissed. The flame caught with unusual intensity, burning blue-white for a moment before settling into hungry orange. He pressed it against the ballroom's back wall, where expensive wallpaper from France had been hung to impress visitors with the Whitmore family's sophistication. The wallpaper caught immediately, the fire racing up toward the ceiling with visible eagerness. Within moments, the entire back wall was ablaze, adding its voice to the growing chorus of destruction. The heat in the ballroom became unbearable, forcing the trapped guests toward the center of the room where they huddled like sheep in a thunderstorm. Through the flames, Josiah saw Master Whitmore's face change as he finally understood the truth. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some kitchen mishap that had spread beyond control. This was deliberate. This was planned. This was personal. Josiah. The name exploded from Whitmore's throat like a curse, carrying across the burning ballroom with the force of absolute certainty. Josiah, you worthless! The rest was lost in a fit of coughing as smoke filled his lungs, but his meaning was clear. Even in his final moments, the man couldn't bring himself to acknowledge Josiah as fully human, could only see him as property that had malfunctioned, as an investment that had failed to perform as expected. Some of the other guests turned to stare at Whitmore with confusion. Who was Josiah? What was their host talking about? But the enslaved people still trapped in the ballroom understood immediately. Their eyes widened with a mixture of terror and something that might have been admiration. One of them, an older woman named Delilah who had served the Whitmore family for 30 years, actually smiled through the smoke and whispered something. That sounded like a prayer of gratitude. Josiah felt a moment of profound sadness for those who would die tonight. Through no fault of their own, the enslaved people whose loyalty or fear had prevented them from escaping, the children upstairs in the nursery who had no choice in their parents' sins. But justice was rarely clean and freedom was never free. Some prices could only be paid in blood and fire. The main support beam across the ballroom ceiling chose that moment to crack with a sound like thunder. Burning debris rained down on the wedding guests, setting silk gowns and tailored coats ablaze. The crystal chandelier finally gave up its precarious hold, crashing into the crowd below with a symphony of shattering glass and terrified screams. Master Whitmore dove aside as the massive fixture fell, barely avoiding being crushed beneath its ornate weight, but his escape was temporary. The ballroom had become a death trap, with fires on 3 sides and no viable exits remaining. The man who had controlled every aspect of so many lives was learning what it felt like to be powerless. Through the chaos, Josiah heard his mother's voice again, clearer now, carried on the superheated air that fed the flames. "Dance with me, baby. Dance like we're free." And suddenly he remembered one of the last good memories before everything went wrong. His mother, exhausted from a day in the fields, had pulled him behind the quarters where no one could see. In the light of a full moon, she had hummed a half-remembered tune and swayed with him in her arms, pretending they were at a grand ball instead of trapped on a plantation that owned their bodies if not their souls. "Someday we'll dance in a place where the music never stops," she had whispered, "where nobody owns nobody and everybody's free to move however they want." Now, surrounded by flames and screaming guests, Josiah closed his eyes and swayed to music only he could hear. The wedding celebration below had become something else entirely, a dance of death, a ballet of justice, a symphony of flames that played the song his mother had hummed in the moonlight. The fire roared its approval, consuming the symbols of wealth and power that had been built on suffering. Persian rugs became funeral pyres, oil paintings of dead masters bubbled and burned, and the mahogany paneling that had taken craftsmen months to install was reduced to ash in minutes. In the center of the inferno, Master Whitmore continued to shout commands that no one could follow, and continued to assert authority that no longer existed. His voice grew hoarse, then desperate, then afraid. For the first time in his life, Cornelius Whitmore was learning what it meant to be helpless. Josiah watched through the flames and smoke as the man who had murdered his mother finally began to understand the true meaning of powerlessness. And somewhere in the cypress swamps beyond the burning mansion, Spanish moss swayed in the hot wind like dancers celebrating the end of a very long, very dark song. The wedding guests continued their final dance, and justice burned bright in the Florida night. Don't forget to subscribe for more macabre stories like this one, and comment below with your thoughts on our protagonist's journey. The grand staircase collapsed with the sound of a dying giant, its mahogany banister splintering into 1,000 burning fragments that scattered across the ballroom floor like fallen stars. The crash sent a shockwave through the mansion's frame, causing windows to shatter and walls to buckle under the strain. What had once been the crown jewel of Hibernia Plantation, a spiraling monument to wealth and status, was now a funeral pyre blocking the last major escape route to the upper floors. Master Cornelius Whitmore stood transfixed by the destruction, his face illuminated by the orange glow of flames that reflected in his eyes like glimpses into hell itself. Ash had settled on his shoulders like gray snow, and his pristine wedding attire was torn and stained with smoke. But it was his expression that fascinated Josiah, the slow dawning of absolute comprehension, the precise moment when a man who had never known powerlessness came face to face with his own mortality. "You think you're clever, don't you, boy?" Whitmore's voice cut through the chaos, hoarse from smoke but still carrying that familiar note of assumed authority. His eyes scanned the burning ballroom, seeking the source of his torment. "Think you can hide in the walls like a rat while your betters burn? You're better." Even now, even surrounded by the flames of his own destruction, the man couldn't conceive of a world where he wasn't superior to everyone around him. From his concealed position behind the servants' panel, Josiah watched as the remaining wedding guests pressed against the far wall, as far from the flames as the room's dimensions allowed. Their fine clothes were ruined, their carefully arranged hair disheveled, their social masks stripped away to reveal the raw terror beneath. These were the people who had built their fortunes on the backs of human suffering, who had sipped champagne while children worked themselves to death in cotton fields, who had danced to music played by enslaved musicians while their own families were torn apart and sold. Cordelia Ashford cowered against her new husband's chest, her white wedding dress now a patchwork of burns and stains. The veil that had crowned her as Southern nobility hung in tatters, singed by embers that fell like rain from the compromised ceiling above. She was 16, the same age Josiah's mother had been when she was first brought to this plantation, when her own innocence had been stolen by men like Thaddeus Ashford. "Pretty little thing, isn't she?" Master Whitmore had said to his overseer just last week, watching Cordelia practice her wedding dance in the music room. "Pure as driven snow, untouched by the realities of life. That's how we keep our women, protected, innocent, clean." "What about the others?" the overseer had asked with a knowing smirk. "The others serve their purpose," Whitmore had replied coldly. "Some are for marrying, some are for using. That's the natural order of things. The natural order. As if brutality was written into the laws of creation itself. As if God had personally ordained that some people were born to suffer, so others could prosper." Josiah pulled his final oil-soaked rag from his trousers, along with his last 2 matches. The mansion was already an inferno, but his work wasn't finished. Not until he faced the man who had murdered his mother. Not until Master Cornelius Whitmore looked into the eyes of the boy he'd tried to break, and saw his own death reflected there. The servants' panel opened with the softest whisper of hinges, a sound lost in the roar of flames and the screams of trapped guests. Josiah stepped into the ballroom proper for the first time that night, emerging from the shadows like an avenging spirit made flesh. Smoke swirled around him, creating an otherworldly halo that made him appear larger, older, more terrible than his 16 years should have allowed. The effect on the wedding guests was immediate and electric. Those who recognized him, the family members who had seen him serving at dinner parties, the neighbors who had watched him work in the fields, recoiled as if they'd seen a ghost. In a way they had. The obedient slave boy was dead, burned away in the fires of grief and rage. What stood before them now was something else entirely. "There he is," whispered Adelaide Beauregard, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. The boy from the quarters. "What's he doing here?" But Master Whitmore knew exactly what Josiah was doing here. Recognition blazed in his eyes brighter than the fires around them, and for the first time since the blaze began, genuine fear crept into his expression. Not the fear of death. That was still an abstract concept to a man who had wielded power over life and death for so long. This was the fear of judgment, of facing the consequences of actions he'd assumed would never be challenged. Josiah. The name fell from Whitmore's lips like a curse. "I should have dealt with you properly when I had the chance." "You mean like you dealt with my mother?" Josiah's voice carried clearly across the burning ballroom, each word sharp as a blade. "Properly?" The surviving guests turned between the two figures like spectators at some hellish theater performance. They didn't understand the history, couldn't grasp the weight of words being exchanged, but they could feel the electricity in the air, the collision of 2 forces that had been building toward this moment for weeks. 3 weeks ago, Master Whitmore had cornered Serafina behind the smokehouse, his intentions clear from the way his hands wandered and his voice dropped to a predatory whisper. "Boy's getting old enough to understand certain things," he'd said, pressing her against the wooden wall. Time he learned what happens to pretty mothers who raise their sons to be uppity. Serafina had tried to pull away, tried to maintain the dignity that was all she had left. Please, master. I ain't done nothing wrong. Josiah ain't done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. Whitmore had laughed, the sound ugly in the humid night air. Boy looks at me like he thinks he's my equal. You taught him that. You filled his head with ideas about being something more than property. He's just a child. The first blow had silenced her protests. The second had driven her to her knees, and Josiah, hidden behind the chicken coop where he'd gone to collect eggs, had watched every moment of his mother's final degradation. Now surrounded by flames and smoke, Master Whitmore tried to summon the same authority he'd wielded that night. You're nothing but property, boy. Damaged goods that need to be disposed of. You think burning down my house makes you something special? You're still just a slave playing with fire. Josiah struck his match. The flame bloomed in the smoky air like a tiny sun, casting dancing shadows across his face. The wedding guests pressed closer together, sensing that something momentous was about to happen, something that would define not just this night but the very nature of justice itself. I'm not your property, Josiah said quietly, his voice carrying with perfect clarity despite the chaos around them. I never was. You can own a man's body, Master Whitmore, but you can't own his soul. And souls? He touched the flame to his oil-soaked rag, watching as fire raced across the fabric like liquid lightning. Souls demand payment for blood debts. He hurled the burning rag directly at Master Whitmore's feet. The kerosene-soaked floor erupted in flames, creating a circle of fire around the plantation master. Like some biblical vision of judgment, Whitmore stumbled backward, his expensive boots smoking as he tried to escape the inferno that rose around him. His face, illuminated by the orange glow, showed a mixture of rage and terror that was beautiful in its raw honesty. You want to burn me alive? Whitmore snarled even as the flames licked at his clothes. You think that makes you better than me? You're nothing but a murderer, a killer. Yes, Josiah replied simply. Just like you. The acknowledgement seemed to break something fundamental in Master Whitmore's understanding of the world. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment as if the admission of equality, even in evil, was more shocking than the fire that surrounded him. He had built his entire identity on the assumption that his actions were justified by his superiority, that violence was acceptable when perpetrated by the powerful against the powerless. But here stood his victim's child, claiming the same right to violence, the same justification for murder. If Josiah was a killer, then so was he. If Josiah was evil, then so was he. The moral framework that had supported a lifetime of cruelty crumbled like the burning mansion around them. The other wedding guests scattered, as far from the confrontation as the room's burning walls allowed, but their escape routes were cut off, their fates sealed by weeks of careful planning. Some had already succumbed to smoke inhalation. Their bodies crumpled against the walls like discarded dolls and expensive clothes. Others still fought for each breath, their social graces useless against the democracy of suffocation. Josiah watched Master Whitmore dance in his circle of fire, the flames growing higher as they fed on the man's panic and the kerosene that had been strategically placed throughout the ballroom. The master's carefully waxed mustache singed and curled, his imported silk shirt began to smolder, and his polished boots started to smoke. Please, Whitmore gasped, the word torn from his throat like a confession. Please, I can pay you. I can give you your freedom, give you money, land, anything you want. But Josiah was no longer interested in what Master Whitmore could give. He was focused entirely on what the man owed. My mother's name was Serafina, he said, his voice carrying over the roar of flames with supernatural clarity. She was 28 years old when you murdered her. She sang hymns while she worked, told stories to the children in the quarters, and never raised her hand in anger to anyone in her entire life. I didn't murder. She loved me enough to die protecting me from you. Josiah struck his final match, the last flame he would need. And I love her enough to make sure you join her in whatever comes after. He dropped the match at his own feet, igniting a final trail of kerosene that raced across the ballroom floor toward the huddled wedding guests. The fire completed its circuit, turning the entire room into a furnace from which there could be no escape. Master Cornelius Whitmore, who had spent his life believing that some people were born to rule while others were born to serve, who had murdered and raped and tortured with the confidence of a man who would never face consequences for his actions, finally learned what it meant to be powerless. His screams joined the chorus of the dying, and the flames of Hibernia Plantation burned brighter than they ever had before. The ballroom had transformed into a vision from Dante's deepest circle of hell. Flames rose from floor to ceiling in towering columns that twisted and danced like demons celebrating the end of the world. The heat was beyond human endurance now. The air itself seemed to burn, searing lungs with each desperate breath. Crystal wine glasses exploded like tiny bombs as the temperature soared beyond their tolerance, sending sharp fragments to join the rain of burning debris that fell like apocalyptic snow. Master Cornelius, Whitmore's screams had evolved from rage to agony, to something primal and inhuman, the sound of a soul being flayed by fire. His expensive clothes were no longer smoldering but blazing, the fine fabrics becoming a second skin of flame that clung to his flesh with hungry persistence. He stumbled through his circle of fire like a man possessed, his carefully groomed appearance dissolving into something from a nightmare. Please, the word tore from his throat, barely recognizable as human speech. God in heaven, please. But God, it seemed, was not listening to Master Cornelius Whitmore tonight. Josiah stood at the center of the inferno like a dark priest conducting a service of damnation. The flames parted around him as if recognizing their master, creating pockets of cooler air that allowed him to breathe while the wedding guests suffocated in smoke and superheated air. His clothes were singed and his skin gleamed with sweat, but he remained untouched by the fire that consumed everything else. Justice belongs to the Lord, his mother had whispered during their last conversation. 3 days before her death, they had been sitting by the quarters after another brutal day in the fields, watching the sun set behind the Spanish moss that draped the cypress trees like mourning veils. Vengeance is his, not ours. But what if the Lord is taking too long? Josiah had asked, his 16-year-old heart already heavy with the weight of witnessed cruelties. What if justice needs help finding its way? Seraphina had pulled him close, her work-worn hands gentle against his cheek. Then maybe, baby, maybe the Lord sends angels to light the way, even if those angels have to fall a little to do his work. Fallen angels. Yes, that felt right. Josiah had fallen from grace the moment he struck his first match, had tumbled from whatever innocence a slave child could possess into something darker and more necessary. But if this was hell, then he would be its master. If this was damnation, then he would make it serve justice. The wedding guests who remained conscious were no longer fighting for escape. Such hope had died with the collapse of the staircase and the sealing of the exits. Now they simply huddled together, seeking comfort in their final moments from the very people they had spent their lives viewing as inferiors. Adelaide Beauregard clutched at the arm of Patience, an enslaved woman who had served her family for 20 years, but whose name she had never bothered to learn. Thaddeus Ashford pressed his face against the shoulder of Marcus, a field hand whose back still bore the scars of Ashford's own whip. In their final moments, the artificial barriers of race and class dissolved in the democratic embrace of approaching death. Master and slave, owner and property. All were equally powerless against the flames that cared nothing for social hierarchies or bills of sale. Through the inferno, Josiah could see other figures moving, the ghosts of all those who had died on this plantation over the decades. Children who had succumbed to overwork and disease, women who had bled to death in childbirth because no doctor would treat slave mothers, men who had been worked to death in the fields and buried in unmarked graves. They danced in the flames now, their spectral forms given substance by fire and smoke, finally free to witness the judgment of their oppressors. And there, at the center of the ghostly congregation, stood Seraphina. She appeared exactly as she had in life, tall and proud despite the chains of bondage, her dark eyes blazing with intelligence and love. The wounds that had killed her were gone, replaced by an ethereal beauty that made Josiah's heart ache with longing. She smiled at her son through the flames, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly despite the roar of the inferno. You did good, baby. Mama's proud of you. The validation he had craved, the approval he had needed to justify his actions, washed over Josiah like cool water. He had not fallen from grace, he had risen to meet it. He had not betrayed his mother's memory. He had honored it with fire and blood. Master Whitmore stumbled toward the center of the ballroom, his burning clothes leaving a trail of flame behind him like a comet's tail. His face was no longer recognizable as human. The features melted and reformed by heat until he looked like some creature from the pit. But his eyes, those cold blue eyes that had looked upon human suffering with such casual indifference, still held their cruel intelligence. "You think this makes you righteous?" he gasped, each word a monumental effort. "You think burning us alive makes you better than what you are?" "I don't need to be better," Josiah replied, his voice carrying with supernatural clarity through the chaos. "I just need to be final." Whitmore lunged toward him then, his burning hands reaching for Josiah's throat in a final attempt to assert dominance even in death. But the flames that had spared Josiah turned on his attacker with vicious intensity, creating a wall of fire that sent the plantation master stumbling backward into the arms of his equally burning guests. The ceiling above them groaned ominously, the support beams finally succumbing to the intense heat. Chunks of burning plaster began to fall like meteors, adding their weight to the chaos below. The mansion structure, built to last for generations, was collapsing under the weight of its own sins. Through a gap in the burning wall, Josiah could see the Spanish moss outside catching fire, the gray tendrils becoming lines of flame that connected tree to tree in a web of destruction that stretched toward the horizon. The entire plantation was burning now. The quarters, the barns, the cotton gin, all of it consumed by a conflagration that had grown beyond his original plan into something that seemed divinely ordained. In the distance, he could see small figures running, the enslaved people who had chosen survival over loyalty, who had escaped into the Florida wilderness while their masters burned. Some would be caught by patrols, returned to new owners, punished for their flight, but others would make it to freedom, would find their way to communities of free blacks or sympathetic abolitionists who would help them start new lives. His mother's sacrifice, his own damnation, it had purchased their freedom with fire and blood. The wedding cake, that symbol of celebration and new beginnings, had long since melted into a puddle of sugar and shame that fed the flames with sweet fuel. The presents that had been carefully arranged on their table, silver candlesticks, imported china, jewelry that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, were being reduced to their component metals and gems, their ostentation meaningless in the face of absolute destruction. Master Whitmore made one final attempt to reach the French doors, his burning form lurching across the ballroom like a living torch. But Josiah had planned too well, had studied too carefully. The doors had been not just locked but reinforced, the frames packed with oil-soaked rags that had turned the exits into additional sources of flame. There would be no escape from Hibernia Plantation tonight. There would be no survivors to carry tales of what had happened here. Well, perhaps one survivor. The thought came to Josiah unbidden as he watched his mother's killer collapse in a burning heap near the ruins of the gift table. Perhaps justice required a witness, someone to carry the story of this night forward. Perhaps his own death wasn't necessary after all. "Mama," he called to the ghostly figure that stood watching from the flames. "What should I do now?" Serafina smiled, her spectral form beginning to fade as the fire consumed the last of the ballroom's fuel. "You choose, baby. You earned that right. You can come with us or you can live to tell our story. Either way, you're free now, free to decide your own fate." The ceiling chose that moment to surrender completely, massive beams crashing down in a shower of sparks and flame. The ballroom floor buckled under the impact, creating fissures that revealed the cellar inferno below. Master Whitmore's body disappeared into one of these cracks, swallowed by the very fires that had begun Josiah's night of vengeance. Around him, the last of the wedding guests succumbed to smoke and flame, their expensive clothes and artificial airs reduced to ash and memory. The Beauregards, the Ashfords, the Carlyles, the Suttons, all the great families of the region were being erased from the earth as if they had never existed. Their accumulated wealth, their social standing, their assumed superiority over their fellow human beings, all of it burning away like so much kindling. Before we reach the shocking conclusion, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment sharing your reaction to this twisted tale. Josiah looked up at the collapsing ceiling and made his choice. The flames parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses, creating a path toward the servants' entrance where he had entered the ballroom what felt like a lifetime ago. He could escape, could disappear into the Florida wilderness and emerge somewhere else with a new name and a new life. The boy who had lit the first match was already dead, consumed by the fires of his own making. What emerged from the ashes could be anyone he chose to become. Behind him, Hibernia Plantation continued its death throes, the mansion that had stood as a monument to human suffering, finally receiving its just reward. The Spanish moss outside glowed like a forest of torches, and in the distance, he could hear the sound of other plantations catching fire, the conflagration spreading beyond his original design into something that would reshape the entire region. Justice, it seemed, was contagious. As Josiah disappeared into the smoke and flame, his mother's laughter echoed through the burning ruins, joined by the voices of all those who had died in bondage but now danced free in the fire. Their song of liberation rose with the smoke toward the stars, carrying the story of this night into the eternal darkness where all debts are finally paid and all accounts settled. The Inferno's judgment was complete, but its legacy was just beginning. Dawn broke over the ruins of Hibernia Plantation like God's own judgment, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that mirrored the dying embers scattered across what had once been the grandest estate in northern Florida. The magnificent mansion had been reduced to a skeleton of blackened timber and crumbling stone, its proud columns, now twisted spires, reaching toward heaven like the fingers of buried giants. Spanish moss hung from the surrounding oaks in charred tatters, swaying gently in the morning breeze like prayer flags in some hellish cathedral. The air still shimmered with heat waves rising from the smoldering rubble, and the acrid smell of burned flesh mingled with the sweeter sense of consumed luxury. Melted silver, incinerated silk, the distinctive odor of expensive wine turned to vapor. Where crystal chandeliers had once cast rainbow light across marble floors, there was now only ash and memory. The physical manifestations of wealth and power reduced to their fundamental elements by the democracy of fire. Sheriff Nathaniel Bramwell arrived with the first light, his horse snorting nervously as they approached the devastation. Behind him rode a dozen men from the surrounding plantations, neighbors who had received word of the catastrophe and came to offer aid, though it was clear from the scope of destruction that aid would be futile. What lay before them was not a disaster that could be remedied, but a reckoning that could only be witnessed. "Sweet Jesus in heaven," whispered Reverend Ezra Blackwood, the Methodist minister who had performed Cordelia's wedding ceremony just hours before. His face was pale beneath his black hat, his usual composure shattered by the magnitude of what he beheld. What ungodly fire could have done this? Sheriff Bramwell dismounted and approached the ruins on foot, his boots crunching on debris that might once have been fine china or human bone. The heat had been so intense that such distinctions were no longer possible. In the center of what had been the ballroom, he could make out the twisted remains of the crystal chandelier, its metal frame fused into abstract sculpture by temperatures no earthly flame should have been able to achieve. "Count the bodies," he ordered his deputies, though his voice lacked conviction. How could one count what had been rendered indistinguishable from the wreckage itself? The fire had burned so completely that individual victims could not be separated from the general carnage. All they could do was estimate based on the guest list that had somehow survived in the groundskeeper's cottage. 43 souls, reported Deputy Marcus Cole, consulting a signed piece of paper. The bride and groom, both sets of parents, the Beauregards, the Carlyles, the Suttons. All the finest families in the region, sir. Gone. But Sheriff Bramwell was not looking at the deputy or the ruins. His attention was focused on something far more disturbing. A set of bare footprints in the ash, leading away from the devastation toward the cypress swamp where the water ran dark and deep. The prints were small, too small to belong to any of the wedding guests, and they showed no signs of the stumbling or panic that would be expected from someone fleeing a fire. These footprints walked calmly away from hell itself. "Sir?" Deputy Cole followed his gaze. "Should we follow the trail?" Bramwell knelt beside the clearest print, studying its shape and depth. The foot that had made it was bare, calloused from years of hard labor belonging to someone young and light, someone who had walked away from this inferno unburned, unharmed, unhurried, someone who had planned this. "No," he said finally, rising and brushing ash from his knees. "Let the dead bury the dead. Whatever walked away from here, it's beyond our jurisdiction now." The other men exchanged glances but said nothing. They were practical men who understood that some mysteries were better left unsolved, some truths too dangerous to pursue. The alternative, that a slave boy had orchestrated the deaths of the region's most powerful families, was unthinkable. It challenged too many assumptions, upset too many carefully maintained balances of power. Better to call it an accident. A kitchen fire that spreads too quickly, exits blocked by falling debris, a tragedy that claimed the innocent along with everyone else. The story would spread through the territory within days, carried by riders and riverboats, growing in the telling until it became legend. But legends, Sheriff Bramwell knew, were often just truths that people preferred not to examine too closely. In the cypress swamp where the footprints led, morning mist rose from the dark water like the breath of sleeping spirits. Spanish moss draped from ancient trees created a natural cathedral, its pillars twisted by centuries of storms and seasons into shapes that seemed almost human in the early light. This was where Serafina's body had been found 3 weeks ago, floating among the cypress knees with her blood staining the water and moss. And this was where Josiah now stood, watching the last smoke rise from his night's work. He looked different in the dawn light, older somehow, as if the fire had burned away whatever remained of his childhood and left something else in its place. His clothes were singed but not burned, his dark skin unmarked by flame or heat. He might have been a statue carved from ebony, standing so still among the swaying moss that even the birds paid him no attention. "Mama," he whispered to the swamp, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of water against the cypress roots. "Did I do it right?" The Spanish moss stirred without any wind to move it, and for a moment, just a moment, the gray tendrils seemed to form the shape of a woman's face, smiling with infinite tenderness and pride. Then the illusion faded, leaving only the ordinary movements of plant matter responding to air, currents that existed in the natural world. But the message had been received. Josiah closed his eyes and let the morning wash over him, the sounds of waking birds, the smell of clean water and growing things, the feel of soft earth beneath his bare feet. This was the first dawn of his life as a free man. Even if that freedom had been purchased with fire and blood, he was no longer property, no longer bound by the chains of slavery or the expectations of servitude. He was also no longer entirely human. The fire had changed him in ways that went beyond the physical, had burned away not just his bondage but something essential to his humanity. He could feel it in the way flames no longer held any fear for him, in the way his mother's ghost spoke to him through Spanish moss and morning mist, in the way his footsteps left no tracks in the soft swamp mud, despite the fact that he could feel his weight pressing into the earth. Perhaps this was the price of justice, to become something other than what you were, to sacrifice your own humanity in order to restore the humanity of others. If so, it was a price he was willing to pay. His mother's death had been avenged. The system that had murdered her had been dealt a blow from which it might never recover. And somewhere in the Florida wilderness, freed slaves were beginning new lives purchased with the blood of their former masters. Behind him in the ruins of Hibernia Plantation, Sheriff Bramwell was making his official report. Kitchen fire, cause unknown, no survivors. The bodies would be buried in a mass grave. There was no way to separate master from slave in the ashes, a final irony that would have amused Josiah if he had still been capable of amusement. The other plantations in the region would increase their security, install new locks and hire more overseers. They would tell themselves that what happened at Hibernia was an aberration, a freak accident that could never be repeated. But deep in their hearts they would know better. They would see Josiah's shadow in every slave's downcast eyes, would hear his mother's voice in every spirit sung in the quarters, would smell smoke in every kitchen fire and panic in every wisp of steam. Fear, Josiah had learned, was contagious, and fear could be more effective than fire in breaking the chains of human bondage. A fish jumped in the dark water, sending concentric circles across the surface that caught and reflected the morning light. Josiah watched the ripples spread outward, each one growing larger as it moved away from its source, until they reached the far shore and began to influence the movement of other waters. That was how change happened, not all at once, but in expanding circles that touched everything they encountered. The fire at Hibernia Plantation had been his stone thrown into still water. The ripples were only just beginning. "I got to go now, Mama," he whispered to the Spanish moss. "Got other work to do, other debts to collect. But I'll come back someday. When all the accounts are settled and all the chains are broken, I'll come back and we'll dance together in a place where the music never stops." The moss stirred again, and this time the sound it made was unmistakably laughter, not bitter or cruel but warm and loving and infinitely proud. Josiah smiled for the first time since his mother's death, an expression that transformed his face from something terrible into something beautiful. Then he turned and walked deeper into the swamp, his footsteps making no sound on the soft earth, his reflection casting no image in the dark water. Within moments he had disappeared completely, leaving behind only the memory of movement and the faintest echo of laughter carried on the morning breeze. Years later, when other plantations burned in the night and other masters died in their beds, when slaves disappeared without trace and overseers were found hanging from Spanish moss with their whips coiled around their necks, people would whisper about the ghost of Hibernia Plantation. They would tell stories of a shadow that moved through the quarters at midnight, of a voice that sang spirituals in empty fields, of fires that started without cause and burned with supernatural heat. Some said it was the ghost of a slave boy who had died in the Great Fire, doomed to haunt the places where his people suffered. Others claimed it was an angel sent by God to deliver justice to the oppressed. A few whispered that it was something else, entirely, something that had once been human, but had been transformed by grief and rage into an instrument of divine vengeance. But in the cypress swamps of northern Florida, where Spanish moss swayed in the wind and dark water reflected the stars, the trees knew the truth. They had watched Josiah walk into the mist on that first morning of his freedom, and had seen him choose to become something more than human in order to serve something greater than himself. Whether he lived or died, whether he was a ghost or angel or something altogether different, no longer mattered. What mattered was that justice had found a way to manifest in a world that had tried to deny it. That love had proven stronger than the chains that bound it, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the meek really could inherit the earth, even if they had to burn it down first. The sun climbed higher over the ruins of Hibernia Plantation, and the Spanish moss continued to dance in the morning breeze, carrying with it the laughter of the free and the unbroken promise that justice, like fire, could spread from a single spark into a conflagration that would reshape the world. In the distance, smoke was already rising from another plantation. The ripples continued to spread. What did you think of this haunting story? Subscribe for more dark historical tales and let me know in the comments which disturbing period you'd like me to explore next.